Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Roland Zenology Pro tutorial series. Today we're going to be dealing with the last of the primary interface features, the filter section down here. If you've been enjoying this video series so far, you can check out the Patreon link in the description below or hit the join button to become a YouTube channel member. Okay, let's have a look at the filter section. Now you'll see that I've actually chosen a virtual analog sawtooth sound today. It's a pretty harsh sound, but it's very harmonically rich. If I just press a single note on the keyboard, got all those lovely harmonics to play with, and harmonics is what we need if we're going to start using filters, because filters attenuate or boost, in other words cut or boost, different frequencies depending on the type of filter. You've got filters that cut away high frequencies. They're typically called low pass because they're only letting the low stuff through. High pass filters which cut away the low frequencies, and lots of different variants in between. Now the filter section in this synthesizer has its issues, and we're going to deal with some of them today. I think it's a pretty inelegant design, quite frankly, but it is feature rich, it does the job, it's just not pretty. Okay, so what we've got here by default is an LPF, or low pass filter, or to give it its full term, a resonant low pass filter. We'll deal with resonance shortly. We've got two primary methods of interfacing with this filter, the cutoff and the resonance. Cutoff is the frequency around which the majority of the work gets done. Now in typical Zenology form, we've got a 0 to 1023 range here, so we don't deal in specific frequencies, which you normally would do, but because we've got a spectrum analyzer down here, we'll be able to translate the numbers that we're putting into the cutoff into actual frequencies. So the first thing that I'm going to do is press a C on the keyboard and then sweep down through the low pass filter. I'm doing it from the graphical interface here. I could just as easily pick up the cutoff slider and move it that way. They do the same job. And you can see in the spectrum analyzer frequencies appearing and then being cut away again. You can also see this slope, which at the moment is about 45 degrees. That's determined by this value here. This is saying attenuate 12 decibels per octave. So every one of these frequencies, every one of these harmonics has a particular frequency. If you double the frequency of that tone, that's an octave. And so we have a range over which we're operating. A 12 dB per octave filter is fairly gentle. A 24 decibels per octave filter is more steep. So you're going to see, if I press this button here, the slope of this curve intensify. There we go. And that will be represented in the spectrum analyzer. So with the minus 12 dB filter, we get more of those high harmonics back. It's a more gentle filter. The other really important control, in addition to cutoff, is resonance. Now I've done a pretty detailed video on resonance in filters. I'll put a link to it above. But essentially it accentuates that cutoff range. In other words, the frequencies around that range are going to get significantly boosted. And you can see it in the spectrum analyzer. Here they are. Now if I push that resonance far enough, it's going to enter a state called self-oscillation, where the filter circuit itself begins to generate its own harmonics. And this can be a really intense and pretty violent sound. So I'm just going to make sure that my volume is quiet enough so that we don't get caught by surprise. There we go. And you get all of this crazy kind of computer chatter noise. Now this isn't an effect that I imagine you're going to want in all of your songs all of the time. And I think it sits more comfortably in the kind of the sound design domain, rather than, this isn't a particularly pleasant sound for songwriting, but you know, in the right place it can be used. Generally speaking though, you're going to want to be a little bit more circumspect with your resonance controls. And then you start to get pretty classic filter sweep sounds. Now as we've seen in previous videos when we dealt with the LFO, you can map the LFO to the filter. So if I introduce this sine wave modulation to the filter control, it's increasing and decreasing the cutoff in accordance with this LFO. Press Control, click to remove that effect. And in terms of the basic functionality of the filter, that's pretty much it. You can get a lot of really interesting sounds just knowing that much. Let's have a look through some of the other different types of filters. So we've got a band pass, which creates a peak in the middle, or a filter boost in the middle, and then attenuates both low and high frequencies. A high pass filter, which is pretty self-evident, and you get this really harsh, thin sound because it's throwing all the low frequencies away. A peaking filter, PKG, is similar to a bandpass filter, but it doesn't attenuate anything. So if we have a look at the bandpass, you can see that we've got stuff basically being attenuated or subtracted from the sound. Harmonics are being taken away, whereas with a peaking filter, we only boost around the cutoff and we don't take anything away. One fairly good use case for peaking filters is as a wah-wah effect. As opposed to the bandpass filter equivalent is going to be a much more intense effect because you basically just built a bigger mountain around the cutoff point. Got a couple of low pass variant filters, LPFs 2 and 3. These things don't have any resonance control. You can see that the resonance has basically disappeared. It's not being displayed here. And they're more gentle curves. So these are filters that, well, the manual suggests that you might want to apply these on things like an acoustic piano, something where you want a more gentle or understated filter effect without those sharp spikes that you get from the resonance. Now there are two different primary filter algorithms in the Zenology. Everything that we've looked at so far, these 6 filters across the top, are time variant filters. These filters on the bottom row are voltage controlled filters. You're going to see these terms when we head over to the Pro Edit screen. And the voltage controlled filters are more akin to the kinds of things that you'll get in an analog synthesizer. In fact, 3 of them are direct emulations of circuits from analog synths. Roland's own Jupiter, and then these options over here are the Moog and the Prophet 5, which is interesting because neither of those synthesizers were developed by Roland, but basically they just give you different types of filters available. And one of the interesting features with the VCF filters is that they behave differently. When we're dragging around in the graphical interface, you get a kind of more organic mode of operation. And there's actually a feature, I'm going to jump over to the Pro Edit screen now because this is an interesting point at which to talk about one of the options over there. I'm just going to click the filter button to get us down to the relevant section. This HPF cutoff control is just an absolute law unto itself. This is one of those situations where Roland take a perfectly reasonable concept and push it to extremes. Have a look at what this filter looks like. So we've got a horizontal line going up into the cutoff point and then kind of with a bent slope down to 0. Now I'm going to turn my HPF cutoff to about 50%, 526 is close enough. Got a completely different shape. So what's going on here is that there's an internal 6 dB per octave high pass filter inside the circuit. You can't see it from the main interface. This is one of my issues with the visual edit screen. It's unrepresentative of what's actually going on because we've got this hidden control that's only accessible to us via the Pro Edit screen, and depending on where I set this HPF cutoff, we're going to get different curves being drawn, dramatically different curves being drawn. You can see now that no matter where I put my cursor, we're doing some very serious attenuation of that curve. Pull this back down to 0 and we get a more traditional appearing curve. So I don't know why they've not given us access to the HPF cutoff feature over in the main interface, but there you go. And it's not to be confused with the control immediately underneath it, which is your primary cutoff. So that's reading 684. And there you can see cutoff 684. You can also see that in the VCF filters, we've got an extra range option available to us, a -18 decibels per octave filter. Okay, so the HPF cutoff thing is a bit quirky and I'm not a huge fan, but I'm prepared to let that slide. Where things go a little bit more off the rails is when we start looking at this envelope tab. First of all, let's have a look at it to see what it can do. I'm going to get us back to a nice simple LPF with a not too dramatic resonance. Now we head over to the envelope tab. And what we've got here is a pretty unintuitive straight line, but it's actually a fully featured envelope. It's just that all of the nodes are clustered around 0. So first of all, you have to drag them all out to find out where they all are. And finally, you rest the thing into some sort of control. Now that I can draw a reasonable envelope, we have some hope of understanding what it is. What's going to happen is that the envelope is going to modulate the cutoff frequency over time. So as things stand at the moment, our filter has a cutoff of 666, which when I press a note on the keyboard is translating into a cutoff of just over a K, just over 1000 Hertz. But I've drawn this complex envelope shape. Now I need to introduce an amount of envelope depth, so I'll do that. In fact, I'll max it out. I'm going to press the same note. Here's the peak. Now, did you see some really odd behaviour there? We saw the peak sweep through the frequency curve and then freeze or stall at the upper limit, and then eventually come back and immediately bounce. So we got some quite strange behaviour. I'll do it again. Here we go, and then we've stuck. And then we sweep down, and then we sweep up. What you're actually seeing there is the effect of the filter cutoff already being at a significant positive modulation value. In other words, we're 2/3 of the way through the entire cutoff frequency anyway before we start. That's the natural native tone of the sound. When I then begin to increase that cutoff value, there's only so far for me to go. So what's actually happening is at about here, and all of this is relative, it depends on what the numbers are, so I can't be exact, but about here on the curve, we've actually hit maximum cutoff value. There's no further frequencies to be reintroduced because we're not attenuating anything anymore. And then for a period of time specified by us traveling up this envelope here and then back down again, we're fully maxed out. So when you're hearing that frequency banging away at the high shelf, we're basically traveling up here and then down here, and we jump back onto the train at about this point. Then you hear the frequencies get attenuated, reintroduced, and then once again at about this point we max out, and it doesn't matter how high this envelope curve is here, we're already at maximum modulation. So you need to be aware that the envelope is applying exclusively positive modulation to something that's already 2/3 of the way through its range. Things get really confusing when you turn the envelope depth down the other way. So now we're at -63, a fully negative envelope, and we've literally flipped all of that logic. Now what you're going to hear is the original sound as the key is pressed, with our resonant peak at just over 1K, and then loads of frequencies going to get cut away. And then we have a period of complete silence where we have no frequencies to play with, and then you get the little spike, which is the inverted version of this spike down here. Now, I really dislike inverted envelopes. I would much rather them have made a bipolar envelope that allows me to set the depth of it, but I can see visually when the envelope is in positive territory and when it's in negative territory. By making the envelope exclusively positive, but giving us a negative depth value, it kind of, it slips off my brain. I think it's a very unintuitive way to develop an envelope. But anyway, there it is, that's what it does. Other than that, the envelope itself is fundamentally identical to the amplitude envelope. We spent so long discussing that one, I'm not going to rehearse all of that information back over here, but essentially we've got the same number of time nodes, attack phases, decay phases, and then a sustain phase, which is this line here. And as you can see, when I move the sustain node, I only have horizontal modulation. On to my next gripe with the envelope page. What on earth are these two cutoff controls doing? So here we've got cutoff, key follow, and cutoff velocity sensitivity. Now these are features that we've seen elsewhere in the synthesizer. I'll give a very quick demonstration of what they do. I'll get rid of the envelope, and here's my issue with it. I've just turned the envelope depth to 0. Now if I introduce cutoff key follow, I'm going to make my high keys brighter. And there's them getting duller. as opposed to the low keys, which will be, the logic will be inverted. So this is going to be a very dull key, and then it's going to get brighter. So it's basically varying the cutoff frequency depending on where on the keyboard you press the note. What's that got to do with the envelope? As you can see, we don't have any envelope in operation here. This envelope is having no effect on the sound, and yet we've got options here that can only be accessed by switching to the envelope page. It's just terrible design. Similarly with the cutoff velocity sensitivity, this is how hard we hit the key. Let's have some of this. Bright key. Press it as quietly as I can. There we go. That's about as quiet as I can press. You can see the different cutoff ranges appearing in the spectrum analyzer. Perfectly fine feature. I've got no problem with cutoff velocity sensitivity. What's it doing in the envelope page? I don't know. If you toggle between the two pages, you can see that fundamentally the low options are available all the time, except for this weird no man's land where these two controls live, and there is no excuse for this other than they wanted to introduce four features, four different parameters into the module, and they only had space for two. So they separated them out over the two tabs. Let's have a look over at the Pro Edit screen. There are a couple of options over here that we'll very briefly refer to. You can see that in the Pro Edit screen, because you don't have access to those different buttons where you choose your filter type, they've actually split it into time variant filter options, which are the stuff along the top row, and voltage controlled filters, which is everything on the bottom row. Depending on which one of these you've selected, the options below may or may not have any significance. So if you're in VCF mode, it doesn't matter what your TVF filter type is. So you get the 6 TVF filter options down here. I'm getting a little bit sick of saying that stuff isn't particularly impressive, so we'll just move on. Then we've got a cutoff velocity curve. One, as we saw when we were looking at the amplitude envelope, is linear, and then we've got various different logarithmic effects. So this is basically, again, going to be depending on how hard you hit the key, how do you want the synthesizer to respond to your key presses. Not something I ever get overly concerned about. Then we've got a key follow base point, where's the pivot of your seesaw, and a resonance velocity sensitivity. This is useful depending on how hard you hit the key, how intense do you want those spikes to be. I'll give the resonance a good boost. And then introduce velocity sensitivity. So at quiet notes, we don't get all of that resonance. And then as I hit the key harder, it's reintroduced. In the filter envelope section, most of this we've already dealt with before and we don't need to go over. Again, we've got the same level of control over the envelope definitions. This LFO trigger switch is worth a quick mention. In order to demonstrate it, I'm going to have to bring the envelope back in. So let's have a quick review of what we've got with the envelope. Up, hold static, down and up again. Now if I turn the switch on, whatever the LFO is doing, however that's cycling, is going to re-trigger the envelope. So that's the period of the LFO re-triggering that envelope every time. So if I make the LFO speed much slower, you're going to have the opportunity to get through more of the envelope before it re-triggers. We got to about this point on the envelope curve, we come down and we were just heading our way back up before the LFO kicked in and said start again. So I think the TLDR is a really powerful filter with some great options hidden underneath a Friday afternoon user interface. What can you do? Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit the like button if you did, and I'll see you for the next one. Thanks a lot.